Hey, what's up guys? So today I thought I'd bring you a beginner's tutorial video on how to best set up your camera through camera settings. So this isn't going to be a setup video like different gear you can use. It's more the internal settings you can use to get the most out of your camera. So for teaching this, I'm using my A7S II, but the settings should be similar if you have something like a Canon or a Nikon. So I'll be coming back and forth between me and the menus on my A7S II. Sony menus suck, I know. For those of you who've seen it, you feel me. But let's get through this. There are different modes on different cameras. On this ring, you can access multiple modes that your camera is capable of. Typically out of the box, it will be on auto. Since what we're talking about today is filmmaking, if you are shooting with a Sony camera, then set your camera's mode to the film mode. Ignore all the other things, we're not going to be talking about those today. If you do not have this mode, however, then just set your camera to manual because it basically gives you the same options. I just stick to film because, well, it's what it's made for. Okay, so to shoot film, you need to understand three basic things. And this is actually the same for photography as well. You need to understand shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about these three different things and how they can affect your camera. So an exact definition of ISO from Google: in digital photography, ISO measures the sensitivity of the image sensor. So essentially it is the sensitivity of the sensor to light. The higher you turn up your ISO, the more light will be on your image. Now this doesn't mean that there will be more light being let in to your image. The camera artificially adds light to the image. That's why people often want to stick to a lower ISO to avoid something called grain. And if you don't know what grain is, I mean, Google it, but don't look for the vegetable. Just look for type in noisy grain on Google and you'll see what it looks like. However, if you do want to affect something that will let more light in and touch the sensor, that is where aperture comes into play. So a Google definition of aperture, an aperture is a hole or an opening through which light travels. So basically, your lens is it's a hole. You have a hole through which light comes through and touches the center of your lens. So a lower f-stop means that your aperture is wide open, or as wide open as your camera can go. Some can go wider than others. Like there's f 0.85 and then there's f22. So f 0.85, for example, is like all the way wide open, and then f22 will be a tiny pinhole through which there's still light coming through, but not as much as 0.85 or f1.2, which is more common than 0.85. There is a 0.85 f.85 lens though. Crazy color aberration. But anyway, let's stick to the basics. Now, depending on your f-stop, you will achieve different looks in cameras. A higher aperture or a lower f-stop, basically the same thing, but for the sake of this video, I'll just stick with saying f-stop. So a lower f-stop, let's say the f-stop I'm shooting on right now, f2.8. This is gonna let in a lot more light than f16. So shooting at f2.8 will allow me to have a shallower depth of field. So this means I can go from being the only thing in focus and then suddenly the TV is in focus, or all of a sudden my forearm is in focus but nothing else. Now you can achieve even shallower depth of field with a lower f-stop lens. For example, this Samyang 35mm T 1.5, which is essentially an f 1.4. Yeah, T and f stop. Don't even worry about it. Okay, that's not for today's video. So this lens can have a shallower depth of field than this lens because its f stop is lower than this lens. This is often why you'll find when you go to buy a new lens, the difference between a f 1.8 lens and an f 1.4 lens can be something like $400 to $500. I mean, I'm in England, but when I bought this lens in Singapore, so I think the difference was like 500 Singapore dollars, which is like 250, 300 pounds. Probably about $300 US, something like that. And the last thing is shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is a bit more complex, but also not too difficult to understand once you understand it. So there's a rule that every filmmaker follows, which is keep your shutter speed double your frame rate. Now, frame rates will come to, but let's just, for the example's sake, say we're shooting at a frame rate of 24 frames per second, which is the film standard. You want to have your shutter speed at 1/48. Now, you can do this on a cinema camera like my Red, or you can do the next best thing, which is shoot at a shutter speed of 1/50. Basically gonna give you the same look. It's literally like a 2-frame difference, but it works, which is the main point. So if you shoot 60 frames a second, so depending on where you are in the world, you can either shoot 1/100 or 1/120, and you'll get the correct motion blur look. Now, why do you want to keep your shutter speed double your frame rate. This is so that you have the correct motion blur. It is what we're used to seeing in film, and so it's what we deem to be correct. Now, if you have your shutter speed, let's say exactly the same as your frame rate, 1/24 shutter speed, because you're shooting at 24 frames a second, your footage is going to come out very slow and kind of choppy, but in a slow motion kind of way. So everything will kind of blur together. The same thing if you're shooting like 60 frames a second, but you shoot 1/60 for your shutter speed, the same thing's going to happen. And also, if you were shooting 60 frames a second to achieve slow motion, if you don't put your shutter speed, double your frame rate, you can't slow it down correctly, because then your frame will just become all choppy when you slow it down, which is, you know, the whole point of shooting a higher frame rate is to slow it down correctly, right? So with this, you can actually keep in mind, you can create different kinds of looks with your shutter speed. If you set it a bit lower, not so that it's super smooth and blendy and choppy, but maybe a little slower so it creates a bit of a dreamier feel. Like, you can play around with shutter speed. It's not, there are like golden rules, but rules are also made to be broken, because this is a creative field. This is art, right? So you can do whatever you want with it. Now, there's also the other end on the spectrum where you can go over double your frame rate. Let's say you times it by 2.5, or you triple your frame rate with your shutter speed. This creates a different kind of look. So people say it's unnatural because there's less motion blur. Things look a bit faster paced, not really realistic. And a lot of music videos are shot in this way. A lot of action scenes are shot in this way because they want people to see all the action. Every single punch and kick or music videos is just a very typical, like, yeah, it's just a look, right? But that's the thing, it's the creative look. So yeah, so you will of course notice that as we bring up the shutter speed, you will also lose light. So this is where doing slow motion can become an issue if you're shooting in low light. So that's something to keep in mind. If you want to shoot 120 frames a second, you will need to have some light to do that, because the higher that your frames per second is, the higher your shutter speed needs to be. The higher your shutter speed is, the less light there is hitting the sensor. So you have to keep that in mind. Basically, the golden rule is keep your shutter speed double of your frame rate, but it's not set in stone. You can do what you want with these cameras. Yes, I may have dragged on a bit, but hopefully you understand ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. If not, I will put everything in the description as like a definition of what it is, just in case you want to go back, pause, read that, or if at the end of the video you're still unsure, just give it a quick read and you should be able to understand it. So depending on your camera, you will have different recording settings. So for example, this 70D here can record 1080p, but only up to 50 frames per second. This was actually my first slow motion camera, albeit it's not 60 frames per second, it's 50, but hey, I could still do half speed, and that was pretty great to have true slow motion for the first time in my good old 70D. With this A7S II, I'm able to shoot up to 120 frames per second in 1080p, cropped in, but that's another video. Which allows you to do fantastic things. I can also shoot 4K at up to 30 frames per second, which is fantastic as well. Having 4K in such a tiny footprint is amazing. So depending on the project you want to do, let's say your camera can shoot 4K, but only up to 30 frames per second, just like my camera. But you want to shoot some 60 frames per second slow-mo action, or even 120 frames per second slow-mo action, then you have to shoot in 1080p. So what you shoot in is dependent on the project and completely up to you. Okay, so the next thing is white balance. Now, I tend to leave this on auto when I'm out and about just vlogging. AWB, that means auto white balance, unless I'm doing a studio setup like this. Now, shooting on my Red, white balance doesn't matter because I can change it in post, but this doesn't mean that I don't set it when I'm shooting, which I have done here. I'm shooting at 5600 Kelvin, which is daylight, which is what I have these lights set to. Did it die? Except for this light here, which I forgot to turn on earlier in the video. This is like a small Aperture M50 light. I tend to leave my white balance on auto if I'm out and about vlogging, if I'm going from outside to into a mall or something and the light changes. Next thing we're going to talk about is setting up your focus. Now, the first thing I recommend doing, if it isn't on already, which I don't think mine was when I turned it on, is to set up face detection autofocus. This is a lifesaver when you're vlogging and can also be a huge pain in the butt if you're using an A7S II, because the A7S II's focus is by contrast, which I'm not going to explain because it's a little bit complex, and also, to be honest, I don't fully understand it. I just know it's not as good as phase detection. I would set up phase auto detection so that when you're out and about vlogging, let's say you're doing a YouTube video like this, right? And you can move about and then have the camera follow you and keep focused on you. Now, I'm using a Red, which does and doesn't have autofocus. It's autofocus that you wouldn't really bother to use. This is a cinema camera, it's going to be manual focus. So unless I grab the lens, which I'm not going to do, I'm gonna come out of focus here, or if I go too far back, then I go out of focus. If you have face detection autofocus set up on your camera and it's a normal like mirrorless or DSLR, it will follow your face. Next thing you want to do to make sure your camera actually uses face detection, just pointing out, I am fully referring to the A7S II from now on. Although all settings will be similar among different cameras, I'm just letting you know that just in case you don't see something I'm talking about, it may be in a different area on your camera settings page, or it may not even be a feature on your camera. If it's not, sorry. But this is what I have, so this is what I'm talking about. To make sure that your face detection works, you want to set your focus area to wide. It will not work if it's in any other mode. If you have the focus point set to center, then the camera will always focus, guess where? In the center. So you could be on the left side here. Am I on the left? I'm on your right. On the right side over here, and the camera will focus right down the middle onto that chair. Now having it set to wide means that it will look at the entire image for where it should keep in focus. Now, usually if there's no face, it will keep focus on what's moving, what's closest. Something that seems to be interesting is the way I seem to analyze it. Basically, let's say like you have a dog in front of you and it's moving about and you're following it. It will realize that's something moving in the scene. I'll try to keep focus on that. You also have the option to set a zone, which will mean you can set a certain part of the screen to always be in focus. You can have it set to center so that the center will always be in focus, even if there's a face there, which is what I used to have because I always used to have my face in the center. You can also set a flexible spot, which can be useful if you're doing something else like filming a wedding and you want to keep focus on a certain spot. An expand flexible spot is just a bigger one. Okay, the next thing, I'm not sure if this is on all cameras, but it's on all Sony cameras, and that is the function menu. The function menu is so useful. Now, one of the most useful things about this camera is the functions button. The function button gives you access to 12 settings quickly and easily. So this lets me change my focus area real quick. I can change my ISO, even though that's already set to another button. You can change the focus mode from autofocus continuous to manual focus, although you can also set that to a custom button with just one click so that you can change it. It's basically a one button shortcut to very useful settings, which you can customize within the settings menu itself. You can set up to 12 settings for quick access with the function button. So something I have here is the autofocus type, the focus selection. So if I want to have wide, if I want to have it in the center, or if I want to set a specific point on the screen that I want it to focus on, or if I want to change the microphone sensitivity, or even the white balance, which is actually my most used function button setting. It saves you from having to dig through the settings and all the horrible pages that Sony just, guys, you need to clean up your settings. And the last thing for setting up your camera to the best settings possible is to shoot in a log profile. So my Red records in RAW 5K. Now, your camera is not likely to do this, but what it is likely to do is have a log profile like this. So a log profile allows you to have as much information as possible that the sensor can capture. It will give you more detail in your highlights and more detail in your shadows. And this means that you can have an overall better looking image, more color data, and it just looks better. So the difference from having a flat profile and not having a flat profile applied is basically that. If you have a flat profile, it means you can grade in the editing suite of your choice and you have more information to play with. You can either crush the blacks or you can keep the information in the blacks. You can bring down the highlights if they're a little bit too bright, or you can make them overexposed if you want to, if that's the look you're going for. You can change a lot more because there's a lot more information for you to play with in post when you shoot with a flat profile. I always recommend shooting with a flat profile, even if you're doing something as simple as vlogging, if you can, of course. If your camera doesn't have a flat profile setting, then I would recommend looking up a YouTube video on how to create your own flat profile setting in your camera and using that user-defined preset with your camera. So what I do with my A7S II is I use Cine 2 or Cine 4. I have custom Canon colors loaded onto my camera. So basically I changed the picture profile settings myself. I bought the information from the guy who made it. Is it like EOS Colors HD or something like that? I'll put a link in the description for you guys if you want to check it out too. But this is only useful if you have a Sony camera, just so you know. You can basically have near Canon colors, as close as you can get. Now, it has an S-Log2 picture profile and a Cine 2 picture profile. If you are using the camera straight out of the box, you have access to all of those, but you have access to S-Log3 and you have access to Cine 4. Now, because of the bit depth that you get from this color, you get 8-bit color from this camera. I'm not going to go into detail about that. I'll leave that for another video. Basically, the color isn't as good as, for example, this camera, which has a higher bit rate color depth, which means the camera looks better. It's like 12-bit or something like that. I think that's it. There are cameras now that can output 10-bit color over an HDMI cable to like an external recorder or something like that. All this means is you get more information, you get more color information. So when you color in post, the image is less likely to break down. So with my camera, I can grade very harshly and it just won't break down. The image just looks great each time. Oops, I didn't mean to tap the microphone. The image won't break down. If I was to grade my A7S II footage the way I grade this, it's more likely the colors will break down, things will fall apart, it will look grainy, there'll be noise, it won't look as good. And that is why I don't use S-Log3 or 2. However, I've seen people use it and the footage looks great. I think it depends on the job, and also if you just keep a careful eye on your scopes, on your exposure tools that are built into the camera. But if you're a beginner, which is why you're watching this, you're not looking to deal with all that. You just want a flat profile that's easy to work with. So I'd recommend using Cine 4, and you can find that in the picture profile settings within the settings of your Sony camera. So I just pressed a custom button, which is custom button 2. You can access the picture profile settings in the menus, however, by going to page 1 and then I think page 3 or 4 of it, 5. Oopsies, there we go. Picture profile, and then you can select your picture profile. Now, all these picture profiles do different things. So having it off, there's no picture profile. You'll get what you get straight out of the camera. And then there's just different looks to the different picture profiles. So if you select the right picture profile, you will have a flatter image. But to know what each one does, you need to go into the settings. So if I hit right, then you'll see all the details of the settings. Now, the main thing you want to concern yourself with is if the gamma is set to something like Cine 1, 2, 3, or 4. Number 4 is what I'd recommend for most people, especially if you're just starting out, but you want to use a flat profile. Cine 4 is flat enough, but it's not too complex to expose correctly that you'll mess up and have very noisy footage in post to deal with. Now, you can also use something like S-Log2 or S-Log3, but those are the more complex ones that I just pointed out. So I wouldn't recommend using them if you don't understand proper exposure. Alright guys, I hope this video was helpful. I hope now you have your camera set up to the best way possible for you, or at least to a way that you like it. And I hope this video was informative. Remember, I'll put descriptions of the terms I used in the video below. So if you get confused, you're not sure about something, then it's all there for you to reread again. And yeah, sorry this was more tuned to Sony cameras. I know there's like a newer Nikon, a newer Panasonic, there's a new Canon M50. I'm a Sony guy through and through, and also a Red guy through and through. So although not to say I haven't used Canon in the past. So I hope this video was useful to you guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.